committee is conducting the debate on the performance of the 2011-12 and current operations of Crown entities, public organisations and state enterprises. The question is that the report of the Commerce Committee on New Zealand Tourism Board be noted. Tura Flavel has the call. He's got about 2 minutes remaining if he wishes to take it. If not, the question is that the report be noted. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. I understand that the next matter which the committee wishes to debate is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. The question is, where are we? The question is the report of the Finance and Expenditure Committee on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand be noted. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to speak briefly on the Reserve Bank. The reason why this is important is that the Reserve Bank gave a very important report to the Finance and Expenditure Committee last week about financial stability. And the key point that they were making in their report was that the out-of-control housing market is threatening the financial stability of the financial sector and the banking sector in New Zealand. When I asked the Governor of the Reserve Bank directly whether the New Zealand economy had rebalanced, which the government set itself as its top economic priority when it first came into government, the Governor gave a very direct answer that the New Zealand economy has not rebalanced under this government. That is, if you look at the relationship between the internationally competitive sector of our economy, or the tradable sector, versus the non-tradable sector, the non-tradable sector is once again growing dramatically. That means that our current account deficit is growing as we spend a lot more than we earn, and eventually, as Treasury projects, it will increase our overseas debt very significantly. So the key criterion that this government set itself when it came into office was to return the economy back to balance between the tradable sector and the non-tradable sector, and what the Reserve Bank is saying very clearly is that this hasn't happened. This is very important for people to understand in Budget Week. In Budget Week, the Treasurer will make a big deal about the fact that after borrowing around $40 billion, Bill English might stop borrowing money in the next couple of years, that is, return to a fiscal surplus. This doesn't mean that the country stops borrowing money. In fact, New Zealand is borrowing money hand over fist. We are currently running a current account deficit of 5% of GDP, which means that we have to either borrow 5% of GDP per year, which is about $10 billion, or we have to sell assets worth that much per year. And any country that persists in borrowing or selling assets on that magnitude every year is a country which is on a path to a crisis. Because if you persist with a massive current account deficit like that, as this government projects to do, and as the Reserve Bank shows that we're projected to do, then you have not rebalanced your economy, and in the long run there will be a very significant adjustment. The problem is that the government has focused in its rhetoric purely on the fiscal surplus, which is significant and important. After borrowing about $40 billion, it is about time Bill English stopped borrowing so much money and putting future generations into debt. After borrowing that much money, it is time to go into a fiscal surplus. But the point is that the country as a whole has been thrown into a massive deficit as a result of the policies of this government. Now, Bill English told us that he would fix this problem. In fact, he told us it was his #1 economic priority to rebalance the New Zealand economy away from consumption and debt. In fact, he has done the exact opposite. And what we're seeing in New Zealand now is that the tradable sector is shrinking and the non-tradable sector is growing, and that's the result of that is that the current account deficit is growing according to Treasury and the Reserve Bank's projections. Now, Treasury's projections are that the current account deficit will increase to about 6.5% of GDP. The Reserve Bank itself says that the current account deficit could increase even more than that as a result of the overvalued New Zealand dollar. Unfortunately, the government won't do anything to intervene against the currency. Now, we've seen the Reserve Bank itself has recently told us last week that they are intervening against the New Zealand dollar to try to bring it down using their reserves. That's not likely to be very successful because the quantum involved is pretty small, whereas what we're seeing with other central banks overseas is they're using very large amounts of recently created money, quantitative easing, in order to reduce the value of their currencies and make their tradable sector more competitive. In New Zealand, our government is not doing anything about the overvalued exchange rate, with the result that the tradable sector is suffering and the result that we're now running a very, very large current account deficit. It is the second largest in the OECD, second only to Turkey, and is projected to increase. So if future generations want to have a country that isn't owned from overseas, if future generations want to have a country that isn't highly indebted, they won't simply be looking at the question of whether the government is running a fiscal surplus, though that is significant. The much bigger question, the question that Bill English identified himself as the much bigger question, is what is the balance between the New Zealand economy as a whole and the rest of the world? And on that question, what the Reserve Bank said very clearly is that rebalancing has failed. When I asked the Governor of the Reserve Bank what would happen if we continued down this path, he said ultimately there would be a correction which would be forced on us by our creditors and by the foreign currency markets. So the choice before us is, do we make that adjustment ourselves or do we leave it for someone else? That is the choice that faces us here.
David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's very disappointing to see that the